Hey, hope you're doing all right today. In this video, we're going to go through a somewhat common little mini project that pops up in interviews, especially for React and front end based positions. So we're going to create a form. It's going to have a couple of inputs. It's going to do some stuff when we submit it. I'm going to walk through some questions to ask, some things to think about when you're trying to communicate your thought process to your interviewer, and then some ways to improve the code. So we're going to start off with kind of a smash and grab, like very kind of intro level solution to the prompt, and then we'll go through and clean it up and make it more efficient, and kind of explain some of the thought processes behind each of those decisions. So over here, I just made a create React app, and everything is pretty much as it is, boilerplate, aside from just ripping out everything in the middle of this div. I'm going to give us some more space, close out this side tab, and we have two requirements. Create a form that accepts a first name, last name, and email. And then when a user submits the form, display the information in an alert box. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward, not super complicated to put together. It's a good idea to start off with some clarifying questions to your interviewer. So you can ask whatever you want, but a couple of ideas that come to mind right off the bat. 1, are the fields required? 2, do we need any sort of input validation? 3, is there any sort of styling that's required? So sometimes this might pop up as like a take-home project that you need to work on, at night or over the weekend or whatever, and they'll give you a little design and some extra requirements. Other times it might just come up in the middle of an interview. Hey, we're going to share a screen. Go ahead and build this form out. So those are some questions that I might think about. But with that in mind, let's go ahead and say that there are no design specifications for this, and that each input is required, and we'll leave it at that for now. So let's go ahead and get started inside of our div. We know we need a form. That form is going to have a label, HTML4, first name. Close that off, put first name as our label, and then we'll have our input. We'll give it a name of first name, an ID of first name, placeholder, first name. We'll say it's required. We will give it an ID of first name. We'll give it an on change of handle first name. And this is actually going to be a placeholder. I'm going to replace this here in just a second. And then we'll give it a value of first name. Cool. So we have our first input. Let's go ahead and work through the functionality of this first name, and then creating the inputs for last name and email should be pretty straightforward. So you might notice that up at the top, I have not imported React. That's because this is version 17.0, I believe. And as of that version, you no longer need to import React at the top. However, we're going to be using the useState hook, so we need to import that. And we'll have our first piece of state, which is going to be first name, and our updater, which is going to be set first name. And we'll set it to an initial state of an empty string. This on change, I set it to reference a function called handle first name. What we'll do instead, and we'll come back and refactor this, you could certainly create a handle first name function up at the top. What I'm going to do is just run this inline. So we'll take our event, and we will set our first name equal to e.target.value. Now, if we save it, cool. One thing that I said that this was all boilerplate standard. One other thing that I did add in the app.css. So if you were just coding along, you're like, wait, why does mine not look like that? I did add this section here, input display block, to keep the inputs from like going side to side when we add more, and then a margin of a half rem top and bottom, and then auto left and right so that it centers it up on the page. I just thought that looked a little bit better. I know there are no style requirements, but this was one thing that was just kind of bugging me when I was working through this. So with that in mind, if you do not have React Dev Tools, I've got Firefox. They've got this in Chrome as well. Open up the Dev Tools and go over to Components. There's my app, there's my state, and if I start typing into it, cool, it updates. So that's working. Cool. Now let's go ahead and create our last name and our email. One thing we're missing on this input, we'll give it a type of text. So I'm going to grab everything from the label up to the top. And then I'm just going to copy and paste it twice. So this one is going to be last name. And we'll go through and update everything accordingly. We're going to set last name, which is not yet created. So we should probably see an error here shortly. And if you're not seeing yours automatically, that's just because I've got the setting in VS Code to automatically save after a little delay. So that one looks good. And then email, HTML for email. Placeholder, we can say email address. ID email, set email, e.target.value. Value is going to be email, and the type is going to be email. Okay, so now we're getting a couple of errors here. So let's just copy this first name, use state hook, and update it. So now we have our three inputs, pieces of state. We have first name, last name, and email. And let's take a look why that is not yet updating. Values email, setting email to e.target.value. Let's try make sure it's saved and refresh. Okay, now it's updating. Awesome. Cool. So create a form that accepts a first name, last name, and email. Check. Next, when a user submits a form, let's display the information. So we need to have an onSubmit handler. We'll say handle submit. It'll probably say we've got an error. There it is. So handle submit is going to take in an event. Good practice to get in the habit of e.prevent default. So that's going to prevent the default behavior when you hit submit. It won't refresh the page. And then we'll create an alert. And let's just try out first name first. So we don't have anything to actually submit this form. So we have an onSubmit handler. Let's add a submit button down beneath this last label. Let's do button type equals submit. And we'll say submit. Cool. And we click on submit. Cool. There's first name. Now let's see if we add last name. Save. Let's refresh it. Please fill out this field. Okay, cool. Let's just not do anything. Please enter an email address. Different browsers will have different built-in warnings for their input fields. So it only has my first name. So with these alerts, what we're going to need to do is we are going to json.stringify an object, and that object is going to be our first name value, our last name, and our email. And all I'm doing here is using the ES6 syntax where if your key and value are referencing the same value here, you don't need to type it twice. So maybe seeing it will help explain this better. First name alone like this is the same as doing first name set to first name. And then last name and email, same thing. So if I do this, now when I hit submit, now it's giving me my key is first name and my value is the value that's in that first name. Notice that I don't have to do this, so I didn't do it for last name, and it still gives me my last name key and value, and then my email key and value. So now we've checked both boxes. The user submits the form, we're displaying that information. Cool. However, this is not super reusable, and this would not be considered best practice in like a production application. You're repeating yourself quite a bit, and we don't need to do that. So there are some things that we can do to clean up. So let's OK out of this. And instead of having our onChange individually set each value here, let's go ahead and give it a more generic handle change function, which we have not yet created. And so if you're explaining this to your interviewer, just saying like, hey, we've made it work, now let's make it work better. Instead of writing separate functions in line or creating separate functions above, let's make one function and then use it multiple times. So up at the top, we'll do const handle change. And then what we can do is we can reformat how our state up here is set up. Right now we have an individual piece of state for each input, but similar to having the handle change apply to each input and then be able to dynamically update it, which I'll show you here in a second. What we can do is clean up this and just have it be a form and set form. And then instead of an empty string, we can have an object with first name, with last name, and email. Then in our handle change, what we can do is we can set our form. We can spread out our form's state so that we're not updating anything else unnecessarily. And then we can use computed properties, otherwise known as kind of like dynamically updating the key that you're trying to reference. So we're going to use square brackets, and we're going to say e.target.name and set it equal to e.target.value. So what's going on with this weird syntax? Why aren't we setting first name or last name or email to e.target.value? Well, we are. With the square brackets, we're saying, okay, what's the name of this input? The name is first name. So we're going to set our form to whatever key is first name. We're going to set it to whatever value is being typed in that input. So now by adding this name property to each of our inputs, we can dynamically update what populates here and update its value with e.target.value. However, there's another change that we need to make. First name, last name, and email are not defined because we switched it to this form object as opposed to each individual string. So for our values, we just need to go into each one and do form dot. First name, last name, and email are not defined. Okay, so that's here. So now instead, what we need to do, since form already is an object, we can leave that json.stringify. We can cut out the object and just do form. Cool. So one question that might come up in your interview is explaining the difference between controlled and uncontrolled components. We have currently built out controlled components. We know that because we're explicitly setting the value to a piece of React state. So we're setting the value to the form.firstName here, form.lastName. What a controlled component is when React is maintaining the state. So each of these HTML elements that you're seeing here will actually maintain its own state internally. So out of the box HTML input elements keep track of what's being typed in them. That is what would be known as an uncontrolled component. So if we didn't have a value and we're just letting the input take care of its own state via the HTML input, that would be uncontrolled. However, with that, then we'd need to do some extra work where we would need to create a ref or reference to the underlying DOM element and then pull in that information. And it's kind of a roundabout way that we can avoid by making this a controlled component. So by setting the state here and then having React take care of the change and the keeping track of the value, we now have it as a controlled component. And we let React kind of do its own thing and keep track of the state itself rather than relying on the HTML element. So that's a little bit of extra knowledge you can drop in there. So let's go ahead and see if this is all still working. Okay, it is. Great. But there are some issues that we might run into. So if I refresh this and I try and submit, please fill out the field. Okay, I'll fill it out. Please fill it out. And it's going to give me an error. Please enter an email address. But what if I go up here, I delete this. Please fill out the field. Okay, what if I put a bunch of spaces in? Now my first name is a bunch of spaces. My last name and my email have been tracked. So HTML default validation takes care of some things for you, but not everything. So what you could ask or what you might be pushed on is some form of input validation. So oftentimes when you're in an interview, whether it's a take-home project and you're talking about it with your interviewer, or if it's an on-the-spot, let's build this right now, interviewers are going to ask you questions about your thought process. And then oftentimes, especially if there's enough time in the interview, they're going to say, okay, cool, we did this. Now let's move on to this next step. So the next step that we're going to do is a little bit of input validation. So what we can do is let's copy this form state and we'll do errors. Now we can kind of watch what's going on and what's being typed in these inputs and display a little bit of extra helper text in case there are any other errors. So down at the bottom, let's do const validate input. And then what we can do, let's say this might be a better example for like a password field or something like that, but whatever I'm doing here, you can apply to other fields or other requirements. I'm just showing you one way of doing it. So if we say that form.firstName.length is greater than 0 And so that means like if they've typed in it at all, including spaces, and form dot first name dot trim, which means if we get rid of all spaces in the text, and then dot length is 0, then we can set errors. Similar to our form, we're going to spread out any other errors. And then we'll say first name, we'll give it a string and say like, please enter a valid first name. Otherwise, we'll set errors to its initial default state. That'll just get clear out our errors for us. And there are a couple of ways to run this input. I'm going to try it out in a use effect. So one of the advantages to having it in a use effect is that we're going to watch our form state, and then anytime an error shows up, it's going to pop up. One of the potentially annoying things is if if we don't think through some of the edge cases here, it might be kind of an annoying experience. So let's take a look at one of those. So we have a use effect, and then our dependency array is going to be our form state. And anytime that changes, we'll do validate input. So we hit save. Okay, cool. If we hit a space. So notice no errors pop up, but in our dev tools, please enter a valid first name, shows up in our error state. So let's go ahead and display this. Above our label, we'll open up curly braces and we'll do errors dot first name. If there are, then we'll render a paragraph tag with that message. And then we'll just do some inline styling just to keep it a little bit more quick here. So please enter a valid first name. So let's refresh. Space. Okay, so it can be potentially a little bit annoying, like if I hit space on accident and now that error message pops up, it's like, yo, hang on, like relax, I'm about to type in my name. So that's one drawback potentially of using a use effect, and you can think through some different methods for running this validate input. Maybe you run it as part of your onSubmit. But anyway, that's one way of doing it, and then it'll go away once I type in stuff. Another thing is, so let's say we put spaces here, put spaces, email is going to yell at us. So Chris, please enter an email address. So let's get this front part trimmed. Actually, so let's do that for our user. So please enter an email address. Let's go ahead and for e.target.value, let's add on .trim at the end. And so this might be a little bit better of a user experience. So now we're not putting in a bunch of spaces. And one thing you might be realizing now is I can't put any spaces here. So instead of putting the trim on the on change, I'm changing my mind here. What we can do is we can on submit, let's do set our form where first name is equal to first name dot trim, and we'll do the same thing for last name and email. And this should be form dot whatever we're doing here. So now I can add in spaces. but when I hit submit, still giving me that error. Okay, so I guess Firefox is doing a little bit of extra help for us. So if I get rid of the spaces now and I hit submit, cool. So now it's going to trim any of the extra white space around it. And that's just kind of like a helpful little kind of internal method that you can use. It's not necessarily helping out the user in that case, but it might be good on your like database side to get rid of any extra white space. Last thing that we might want to do here is add some sort of disabled state to the submit button. So what we can do is on the button, let's do disabled. And one thing that we could do is we could do like errors dot first name or errors dot last name or errors dot email. But instead, let's set it to this variable that we have not yet created called error. Let's go ahead and create that variable. And there are some different approaches to this. You know, if you're using a loading spinner or any of that kind of stuff, you might have a different variable in mind. But let's just do error for now. And then for our validate input, above set errors, we'll do set error to true. And then set error to false once the error has been cleared. So now, if I have any errors, that submit button is disabled. And until I fix that, now I can submit it. There are some different approaches to this as well. Maybe instead of having like error and set error, you could be like ready and set ready. And you can have an initial state of false or ready to submit, set ready to submit. And then what you could do is watch your inputs to make sure that they're all valid. Set your submit ready to true and then activate this button. There are a couple of different approaches to that, and I encourage you to experiment with that. So we're getting to the point in the video now where there are lots of different improvements that you could still make to this, where we've refactored our handle change, we've added an on submit, we did a little bit of like kind of pre-backend cleanup with this trim. But you might get asked other questions, and the more you prepare for those by looking up kind of your own examples, the better. So a couple of possible extensions. One, you could, of course, play around with styling. If it's a take-home project and they didn't necessarily give you any style guidelines, but they said, like, make it look nice, then go ahead and play around with some different ideas. You could add more input validation. So maybe you'll have a different use case for an email, or maybe you have like a telephone number input field, and you want to try to like dynamically insert parentheses or dashes like after a user has entered a certain number of characters or digits or whatever. Something else that you could do is, if you notice that all of these inputs have pretty much the same set of like characteristics, so we've got like a label with some text, we've got a name, ID, placeholder, etc. What you could do is turn this into a reusable component. So we just made this all in app.js, which obviously you wouldn't do in real life, but what you could do is like create a new file called like input.js, and then that could take in some props for like label text and input name and input ID. And then instead of having these three inputs here, you could then like, import your input that you've created and then like pass in your name and everything, so that now you'll notice like name ID, oops, I have ID twice. Okay. Or like name ID type. Instead of typing them all out multiple times, you could just pass them in as one prop and then insert them in your input component. So those are a couple of different ideas that you can use to kind of extend this video. Let's get rid of this. But just some good ideas for some practice to get yourself prepared in case a question like this comes up in an interview. So hope that you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, as always, leave them in the comments. And until next time, have a good one.